goes on. All right. Just taking inventory. As I said, I'm pretty darn hopeful and confident we'll be through everything by Friday, neuro-wise. So we were finishing our story off. We entered down into the ponds. Next level down. Again, we're looking at similarities and also things that are unique to the ponds as far as function goes. So again, tegmentum, we're talking about this vertical column. The back is the tectum of this brainstem, the front is the basis, and up and down the meat and potatoes, quote unquote, of this brainstem in the middle is where all those cranial nerve nuclei, all those sensory pathways, et cetera, are making their way through the brainstem. So in the tegmentum of the pons level, and the beauty of this is the brainstem's just simply arranged in, numerical order, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, go from top to bottom. So the pons catches 5 through 8. 8 kind of splits the Mason-Dixon line, and some of it sneaks into the medulla as well. But essentially, 5 through 8 sit in the pons. So again, you should have an understanding function-wise that's going on. Trigeminal nerve. We just talked about the, sensation as far as the face goes, the V1, V2, V3, and bringing back all those sensory components as far as proprio, as well as pain and touch, etc. Meanwhile, there's a motor piece to cranial nerve 5. You memorized them for anatomy, lateral, medial, pterygoid, and the muscles of mastication, etc. So that's kind of the basics. So the bottom line is damage in the pons potentially can affect these functions. Then cranial nerve 6 goes nothing really to add other than its function, which we already know, so nothing to chat about too much there. And then cranial nerve 7, motor-wise, is again all your muscles of facial expression. So again, we have already talked about the nuances or the differences between a lesion essentially before it or after it as far as regions of the face. So when you look at this in 3D though, the pons comes in, you've got V1, V2, V3 coming in to do their thing, eventually land in here and bring the information through that lemniscus pathway that we had chatted about. Meanwhile, over here, this is representing the motor piece of it. So this is going out, V3 makes sense, going downstairs to those muscles of mastication. So fairly, quote-unquote, straightforwards. If you sneak down, I think I did highlight 6 and 7. And again, when you look at the external, brain stem, you can kind of count them, and they just follow a trail as well. But again, cranial nerve 6 goes without saying, lateral rectus, and then 7, muscles of facial expression. Cranial nerve 8 is a melting pot of a lot of nuclei as far as the nuclei. There's the vestibular nuclei, and there's 4 of them. There's a top and a bottom and a medial and lateral. So there's a clump of 4 vestibular nuclei, and those are the ones that are kind of, some are over them, in the pons, and some are down in the medulla. So that vestibular nuclei and function will kind of transverse that. The cochlear nuclei, the auditory piece of things, is located just in the pons above the Mason-Dixon line of the 2. So again, damage to this region potentially can involve, auditory as far as function goes. So again, this represents the cochlear or the auditory piece landing in the pons. This cluster here represents, the 4, clumps of nuclei that are the vestibular nuclei of cranial nerve 8. So that's cranial nerve 8. Again, I'm not going to chase on the cross sections. You can just appreciate there's multiple clusters of these nuclei making it up, but we're certainly not going to go down that route. However, damage vestibular-wise, it can have problems. Think about it. This is information that's coming from inner ear. This is information that's involved in cerebellum pathways that we had talked about, that deeper level as far as the fastigial nuclei are just right off the floccular nodular lobe. So it should make sense when you look at some of the outcomes as far as function, but if there's damage, why you have the lesions or the functional loss that you do with a lesion. So I'm going to try to sneak ahead. I thought, nope, I guess I didn't have it, but a lesion definitely would involve any vestibular changes, whether it's equilibrium, balance, tone, any of those things that we had chatted about. Okay, so that's 5 through 8, all landed in ponds, so that's nice and easy. There isn't too much else to discuss other than these deep pontine nuclei. We made mention of it. Corticopontine tract is coming down the front. The midbrain lands in the pons, and then it just plugs into these nuclei that are scattered throughout this pons, really, in this tegmentum, that are then going to go in and plug into that lateral region of the cerebellum, making that loop. So that's the extent of it. Fourth ventricle sits there. We'll chat about it when we do CSF. Everything else is pretty much a repeat of what we've been saying right along for each of the regions. So again, just appreciate these guys are all continuing to run through there in different spots. So we'll scoot down to the front of this. Again, who's running there? We already chatted about. So corticospinal, corticobulbar, whoever happens to be remaining to dropped off, and then finally corticopontine that we had chatted about, obviously with the nuclei just 2 seconds ago. So that should be fairly straightforward. How did I get through? I got ahead of myself. Oops. Oh, we're on to medulla. That's why I'm as bad as you guys. I'm sitting here going boo, 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 boo. So I know it's summer term. So moving downstairs, bottom chunk, tegmentum, you're talking cranial nerves 8 through 12 are sitting there. The ascending tracts that we had chatted about, so it sounds like a broken record for each. So just take a moment to appreciate cranial nerve 8. The only thing I'm going to add to this is it doesn't involve auditory. It's just a continuation of some of those clumps of vestibular nuclei that sit down just below that boundary line between the two. That's all. So again, obviously damage, vestibular signs, whether it's vertigo, balance, nystagmus, any of those types of things if there's a lesion. Let me sneak down. Again, actually I'll pause here. This is just highlighting what I'm saying as far as the extent of that cluster of vestibular nuclei. All right, 9 through 11. You may have figured this out while you're putting together your slides. You may not have. Instant reaction is you take cranial nerve 9, you take cranial nerve 10, you take cranial nerve 11. It will all meet the day before, put it together and upload it, and off it goes. The catch is, functionally, there's probably some overlap. So the person doing cranial nerve 9 might be doing the same thing cranial nerve 10 is, a little bit on some of the motor function. And the reason is, motor-wise, 9, 10, and 11 all basically are dealing with your mouth as far as, articulation, chewing, well, not chewing, but swallowing, etc. So it's really your larynx and pharynx and the palate that these guys are controlling. And they do it through this thing called this nucleus ambiguus, which is a big, tall, long nuclei that kind of transcends this tegmentum region. So this is it. This is what's referred to as nucleus ambiguus. But on the top portion, the fibers for cranial nerve 9 sneak out. You get a little further down, the fibers for cranial nerve 10 sneak out. And then downstairs, some of cranial nerve 11 sneaks out. Remember we talked about that accessory? It's got, the top half of cervical. There's 1, 2 kind of kicking in. They go up, they join up with these fibers, and out they go as accessory nerve plugging into SEM and upper trap. But the bottom line is these 9 through 11 are all that motor piece of things. They all have this motor function. And they originate fairly, in the same area, if you will, and they're all involving the swallowing, speaking, etc. Now, keep in mind, the only caveat, cranial nerve 10, you go, isn't that vagus? Isn't that viscera? Isn't all that stuff parasympathetics we discussed? And yes, that's true. The visceral portion of cranial nerve 10 comes off of here, which is going to be the dorsal nucleus of cranial nerve 10. I thought it'd be on the next slide, but it's not. Maybe it's down, there it is. So that represents the visceral piece of cranial nerve 10. That's that vagus nerve making its way down through the neck and down to the heart, down to your lungs, down to everything in your GI tract till it crosses at that transverse colon. So that's the story as far as 9 through 11 goes and where they're located. But the bottom line is they're all lower third or medulla nuclei. So obviously anything lesion-wise is going to affect the function of those, each of those. And obviously the potential for autonomic dysfunction too as well. Okay, so I can kind of sneak through. I think this is all straightforward as far as 11 and 12, as I said, with the exception of 12 we didn't talk about, so I guess I should back up the truck here. 12 as far as tongue, and we talked about deviation. Remember we talked way back when about what kind of deviates towards the strong side, it pulls it that way. And in the case of the tongue, and they stick out during your physical exam, and it's like two parallels pushing it out even. If one side's weak, the dominant side, pushes it over, if you will. So it protrudes to the weak side, if you will, as far as a lesion goes. Okay, so there's our discussion as far as cranial nerves up and down, essentially 3 through 12 in the brainstem. Again, vertical column, middle vertical column of the brainstem just varies a little bit between pons of medulla and upstairs in the midbrain. Couple other discussions before we leave medulla and move on a little bit. All the usuals, that lemniscus pathways we talked about, all those exist in there, and yep, they're doing their thing. But the other unique thing to point out, if I can find it, everybody starts crisscrossing in the medulla. Motor tracts coming down, they crisscross. Medial lemniscus, proprio from the body, that's where it crisscrosses. That spinal trigeminal tract that's going to sneak over to spinal lemniscus, that crisscrosses. So that's the other key point in all this is the medulla really is the site, and it tends to be more in the lower half where these tracts will cross midline, running from right and then run on the left side, depending on whatever their function is, whether they're going up or down. When you look at spinal cord injury or other types of lesions, we talk about contralateral, ipsilateral. If you know the pathway, it's real easy to figure out what the outcome is. And there'll be about 3 major tracks that I'm going to ask you to be able to follow the pathway. So this is kind of the basis for, memorizing that. So that's why I pause here just to point it out and sort of make a big deal about it. So that's the medulla. So again, we talked about that corticospinal. Above it, a lesion, contralateral damage. Below it, it's going to be running ipsilateral, so ipsilateral damage as far as function. And then again, the pain pathways as far as that spinal and trigeminal pathway to get through. Okay, reticular system. We've talked about cranial nerve nuclei. We've talked about big tracts making their way up and down, and we've talked about the tracts, i.e. peduncles, connecting cerebellum to this brainstem. The only thing we haven't talked about is this huge core nuclei known as a reticular system. Again, I think everybody's familiar with it. And essentially, the temptation is to call it the reticular system and put your finger on it and say that's what it is. But the key is it's really just this diffuse, huge number of different clusters of nuclei along roughly the tegmentum portion of the midbrain running up and down, or not midbrain, brainstem, running up and down it, known as a reticular system. Each of these nuclei have different neurotransmitters, different functions, raphe nuclei, and all these other things you may have heard about associated with different pharmaceuticals affecting them. So often it's, functionally they're referring to a specific quote-unquote nuclei of the reticular system. But I'd like to generically talk about it in terms of the reticular role as far as ascending and descending, again, in sort of a simplistic functional role. So visually, again, it's a cluster going up and down the brainstem. If you look at this artist's rendition, they make it look like this big solid clump of nuclei, but the reality is it's far more diffuse, far more spread out. Somewhere I think reticular means network or net-like, I'm not sure, as far as its background. So over the next 25 slides, you'll see this reticular formation and multiple teeny nuclei scattered throughout. This looks a lot more orderly. When you start looking at cross-sections, they scatter. It doesn't look like a single tract, so it's very difficult just to say that's, quote-unquote, the reticular tract or the reticular formation. But functionally, huge role. This artist's rendition at least put it in columns in terms of function a little bit, but it just gives you an appreciation, and I certainly couldn't memorize or, spout these off to you. I'm not expecting you to either, but it should give you a basis for some of the different, more common ones you may see pop up in different clinical discussion about pathology, neuro-wise. So let's, again, look at this really emphasizes the diffuse network of it all. So I think I've pounded that to a pulp. But looking at it a little more simplistically, you have things talking to all these nuclei, this reticular system. The hypothalamus and things upstairs are talking to it from above. And then down below, there's also feedback. And it's known as the spinal reticular tract. So again, we'll talk about it with the spinal cord, but keep in mind, a lot of sensory input has deeper connections to this reticular system that's going to basically trigger reactions or modulations, if you will. The simplistic or easiest one to wrap your head around is pain. Pain comes in, shoots up, gets up to thalamus, goes to 312, ouch, it hurts on my finger. Meanwhile, it's got some other pathways, gets to the thalamus, a little more diffuse, hits those non-specific parts of your cortex, and that's the kind of more emotional, ouch, I can feel it. But also, some of those tracks stop in this reticular. They kind of, as they go up, they land in the reticular nuclei, and these guys come back down and modulate pain. So there's kind of multiple roles of some of these sensory inputs or multiple destinations, and the reticular system is one of them. And so simplistically, those pain pathways we're describing go through this thing called the spinal reticular tract. So as I said earlier, I'd like to just keep our discussion on reticular system going north and going south, and just attach function. So essentially appreciate the reticular system in general is making its deep connections to thalamus. And again, we've talked about it 1,000 times. If you're going to have a stroke, don't blow out your brainstem. This is the core consciousness, keeping alert and oriented, et cetera. And this is some of the connection. The hypothalamus, the reticular system, and the thalamus, the interconnections are all those deep internal clocks, sleep, wake, alertness, conscious, triggers, things to quote unquote wake up that thalamic drive to make you alert and, conscious, if you will. So that's really the role of quote unquote the ascending reticular formation. So we're being very simplistic, but appreciate it from that standpoint. But it also gives you an appreciation for when you do have the loss of consciousness or any of the damage as far as injury or pathology or stroke goes. This is the part of the brainstem you don't want to start to lose. Meanwhile, we'll sneak downstairs to the descending. This has a little bit of multiple roles. I sort of described its role as far as pain. The other role is modifying motor. Again, some different input. Yeah, it gets up to cerebellum, and unconsciously or subconsciously you're modifying things. Visually, you may see something and purposely modify things as you go around, whatever you're doing. Multiple ways to influence motor output, but the reticular system will do that too as well. So when pain's coming in and other different stimuli, it too is coming back down and inhibiting or enhancing motor function, if you will. So the major pathway for this, reticulospinal. Again, we're going to hit this in Module 6, so I'm kind of skimming over it right now, but just planting the seed that there are motor pathways from this reticular that go downstairs and talk to your trunk and extremities, if you will. And they have two different functions. We will highlight, again, this whole issue as far as a lot of these deep core tracts, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself, have a postural or deeper motor control for a foundation, if you will, and that's your motor tone. And some are very pro-extension, and some are very pro-flexion. Not many are flexion. We've already described the two. This is one of them, the lateral reticular spinal tract. Don't worry about it now. It's going to show up in the spinal cord lecture, and I'll kind of put that one on the shelf of how to discuss it. I'm just trying to give you the big picture. And then the other half of this thing is involved in extension. But the two that are flexion are this one and that rubrospinal tract we talked about. All the other ones, there's these vestibular ones, et cetera, are all extension too as well. But let me kind of pull back. I know we're kind of way into the weeds on this. So bottom line is there's a deep core motor control that's involved. The reticular system will modify based on pain and other core information that's coming in. Meanwhile, autonomic, not going to follow these pathways. I think I just dug them up to kind of remind you of your cardio centers, of your pulmonary centers, the VRG, DRG, and apneutic, et cetera, and appreciate these pathways are running through, and it's the reticular system that's kind of coordinating some of these pathways as well. So kind of keeping that one pretty simplistic at that level so we can keep on scooting through. And then last but not least is pain modulation. This one I'd like it again. I'm not sure how much discussions you've had as far as pain. If you think about it in all healthcare, that's probably the driving thing. People never come in describing their functional loss. It's usually pain is their driving concern. Medically, there's a lot of discussion of how to manage pain, what to do for pain, what levels do we act, what levels don't we act, what levels do we discharge at, et cetera. But pain pathways, innately, we try to modify things ourselves. So a lot of times, as we said, you get the stimulus, whatever the nociception is, ouch, it hurts, gets into the spinal cord, upstairs it's going, and as I described, some of it's going to tell me where in my body it is, some of it's kind of connecting to limbic and getting a little more core. Meanwhile, some of it's stopping in the brainstem to say, let's modify it. And so some of these nuclei in the reticular system send pathways back down right exactly where that pain came in, and at the spinal cord level, they're releasing neurotransmitters that are inhibitory. They're saying, putting the kibosh on, and they're quote-unquote modifying or modulating pain, if you will. Also, a lot of your pharmaceuticals, narcotics, all those things, this is where they're acting. All these specific nuclei of the reticular system, this is their site of action. In fact, I think, my eyes are so bad I can't read the fine print, but somewhere in some of these pain modulation slides, I think they've got the NSAIDs where they act, the narcotic, et cetera, along the way. But that's kind of pull back again, get functionally looking at this, motor as far as core tone, autonomics goes without saying as far as cardio and pulmonary, and then the pain modulation, another huge role as far as the reticular system and all these kind of core nuclei. All right, fun facts, introverts, extroverts. Not so, I don't know how much evidence, but I found this like 10 years ago and it's still sitting here in the slides. So you can read through it, but the thought is, you know, if you're an extrovert, you always need something going on. The theory is you always need to, you know, be getting your reticular system going, and you need some kind of external stuff to do so. So you're seeking out all these, you know, social, fun, exciting things. Introverts are probably, hey, I'm good. My reticular system's keeping me at a good alertness orientation, and I don't need to run out and go bungee jumping or whatever. So anyways, but I don't know how much validity to that is, so pay no attention to the man behind the curtain on that one. So lesion, as I said, I think this goes and speaks for itself, but again, knee-jerk reaction, coma, consciousness as far as function goes, and autonomic, you know, core stuff, and then pain modulation. Last but not least, 3 syndromes. Good news is, locked-in syndrome, we already chatted about it. So this first few slides, just as a reminder, we saw that woman. They described their episode being in the hospital. Everybody pretty much, you know, kind of rush, writing him off. And it wasn't until the nurse made the connection that, hey, she's actually taking in input. She can comprehend, and if she could motor execute it out, she'd be responding to me, and that's her problem. And she figured out how to communicate with her eyes. But going back to what we know about our brainstem now, think about it. Basilar artery, all those pontine artery, blasting out the whole front of that, all those motor tracks going down. The only thing it's sparing, perhaps, cranial nerve 3, whereas it's set way up top in the brainstem, midbrain. So that's why it's, you know, spared. That's why, you know, everything else below it isn't working. So you've got the quadriplegia as far as motor output goes, quote unquote locked in, cranial nerve 10, can't speak, can't articulate, swallow, all that stuff. This is the reticular system, as we said, it's very core central midline. Same thing with the spinal thalamic tract. The irony is this here. The spinal thalamic tract, this pain tract we've described, it's a little more central, often is spared. So this person, you know, can't output, but they certainly can feel pain. So just an unbelievably, you know, it'd be maddening. As I think I joked about blowing a cork. If I was, you know, I'd blow 3 more, just feeling trapped in there. But the bottom line is, just know what locked-in syndrome is, related now a little bit more functionally to what we had just chatted about brainstem-wise, as far as the hows and whys. Other syndrome, midbrain syndrome, it almost comes across like I'm saying it's a vascular scenario, but I'd really like to highlight, often when things go wrong with this region of the midbrain, it's more of a tumor kind of thing or a aqueduct kind of thing. So it's more of a quote-unquote physical cause or space-occupying lesion cause as opposed to just blowing out a vessel. But the potential is there for an artery. But the point is, this syndrome, dorsal midbrain, is going to involve that superior colliculi. We've talked about function-wise, so you can start to predict what's, you know, going to be gone awry. But the mechanics of that cerebral aqueduct, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, this connection between the cerebral aqueduct in between runs through that brainstem. And if you've got a tumor squishing it or anything mechanically, next thing you know, you have a CSF problem of pressure. So ventricles are expanding and blowing out and, you know, creating and wreaking havoc that way. So that's midbrain syndrome. The superior colliculi, when you look through this, that should all make sense. Again, superior eyes, inferior colliculi, auditory. So fairly simple, and same thing as far as the aqueduct damage. Last but not least, pica syndrome or lateral medullary syndrome. We kind of hinted around this when we got to VBI, vertebro-basilar insufficiency. Essentially, it can be damage to the pica, that posterior inferior cerebellar artery that runs along the bottom of this thing, or it could be something with those vertebral arteries that we had talked about. Briefly talked about that in anatomy. But the bottom line is anything to take this out here, so multiple things can cause it, whether it's a dissection of the artery itself or anything else, where it's a stroke of some sort, can result in this thing or this pattern of lateral medullary syndrome. And if you think about it, it's the vertebral artery sends this branch out. It's got to get back to the cerebellar piece of things. That's a no-brainer. But it's really cutting across. Remember way in the beginning, these guys wrap around the brainstem to get to that cerebellum. And when they wrap around, they're plugging into, whatever portion. This case, it's the bottom, so it's the medulla region and the outside portion. So impairment-wise, cerebellum, that makes sense. All the things we had chatted about. The caveat here is it does involve the sympathetic tracts. Again, we're not be able to put a finger on these cross sections. So this is kind of more just connect the dots. But this is where I wanted to just reintroduce the Horner syndrome. If you haven't already gone through it in some other courses, Horner syndrome, anything that's going to disrupt these sympathetic pathways or can involve anything from tumors up in the apex of the my brain's going, you'd call this a lung, wouldn't you? You see how bad it gets? But up on the top of the lungs, the apex of the lungs, an expanding tumor can get those sympathetic ganglion that are sitting along the thoracic spine there. So they too can create Horner syndrome or something in the brainstem that's actually affecting the sympathetic tract. So that's the case here, is this lateral medullary syndrome often results in a Horner's type pattern, which is really the first three are usually the classic that you memorize, so the ptosis, anhidrosis, and meiosis. These other two don't really get quite so much media attention, but technically are part of Horner syndrome. They're all obvious autonomic dysfunction as far as their connections with the face and eyes. Cranial nerve 8 through 12 all goes without saying, although we said by arrangement and in theory this cranial nerve 12, I think it's a little bit more medial inside, so it just doesn't get caught quite so much. But the potential for all involvement for each of these. But with that vertebral basilar insufficiency or something affecting the vertebral artery or pica, you've got the motor response, but also that nausea, vomiting, vertigo response. And that's really from the involvement of the vestibular nuclei. And so that's kind of where the core of that comes from with some of these things you're testing for. All right. So I think that's fairly straightforward, and some of the pain pathways may be affected to some degree, face, not the face, but really the big three or the big thing should be for sure cerebellar signs with Horner's involving cranial nerves 8 through 11 would be typical of lateral medullary syndrome. All right. Thus endeth, hallelujah, our brainstem lecture. And so I will pause it there. And I think that we should easily be able to get through Module 6 on Friday and get on to renal for the last 2 weeks. Any questions, concerns? As I said, my plan is to post those grades. If you don't see them by, say, 8 o'clock tonight, somebody send me an email and I'll get them posted. It means I just forgot. I'll try. Have a good afternoon down there, Worcester, and Manchester, you do the same.